Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 14th of Jan 2022 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on the screen. Time summary for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. The first article for today's analysis appears on page number 12. The article is titled as India-UK kick off the talks for the free trade agreement. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 3 Indian economy. Now before discussing as to how this particular topic becomes important from the perspective of the UPSC examination, let me first give you the background. See, recently the Minister for Commerce and Industry has given a statement that India would be signing almost around 20 free trade agreements with the countries across the world. Out of these 20 free trade agreements, India would be fast tracking the 6 FTAs with the countries such as European Union, UK, UAE, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. However, India's experience with the free trade agreements has been a mixed bag so far. On one hand, the FTAs which we have signed with the smaller economies such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. have led to increase in our exports. While on the other hand, the free trade agreements which we have signed with the larger economies such as Japan, South Korea, etc. has led to an adverse impact in terms of the widening of the trade deficit. So clearly, India has failed to leverage the free trade agreements in order to pursue an export-led model. That is why this particular topic becomes extremely important from the perspective of both prelims as well as the mains examination. From the perspective of prelims, one should be aware about the different stages of trade integration and the list of countries with which India has signed the free trade agreements. As you can see, in prelims 2017 and prelims 2018, questions have already been asked with respect to the free trade agreements. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should have a 360-degree approach with respect to preparing this particular topic of FTAs. So from this particular topic, one should be aware about the need for FTAs for India. That is, why should India sign FTAs? What are its benefits and challenges? And more importantly, what should be the India's strategy going ahead? In this regard, you must know the recommendations given by the Surjit Bhalla committee. So based upon the analysis of all of these topics, a mains question for your practice here could be, India has failed to capitalize on the free trade agreements to promote virtuous economic cycle to the export-led model. In this regard, highlight the adverse impact of FTAs on the Indian economy and suggest some measures to optimally harness them. At the end of this particular discussion, we'll also discuss as to how should you write an answer to this particular question. Further, at the end of this particular discussion, you should be in a position to attempt these 4 prelims questions for the practice. So let us start with the first dimension of this particular article, that is the stages of trade integration. See, trade integration refers to free movement of goods, services, investment and people between the two countries. So when two countries decide to reduce the barriers with respect to movement of goods, services, investment and people, we can say that the trade between the two countries has got integrated. Now this form of trade integration may take place in different phases, starting with the preferential trade agreement, which is the least phase of trade integration, and ending with the economic union. So let's look at the preferential trade agreement. See, in case of preferential trade agreement, two countries come together and they decide to reduce a customs duty on certain commonly agreed goods. So on those goods on which the countries decide to reduce a customs duty, all of those goods will be put under the positive list. So positive list would include those goods on which the countries may decide to reduce a customs duty. Now for example, we have a preferential trade agreement with Afghanistan. We have a preferential trade agreement with Chile. We also have a preferential trade agreement with Mercosur, which is a trading bloc in South America. And then we have the Asia Pacific Trade Agreement. Please do let us know in the comment section as to which are the member countries of the Asia Pacific Trade Agreement and Mercosur. So the first phase of trade integration is a preferential trade agreement. The second phase of trade integration is a free trade agreement. Now the free trade agreement is much more broader and comprehensive in comparison to a preferential trade agreement. This is so because in case of preferential trade agreement, the countries may decide to reduce the custom duty on certain commonly agreed goods which are part of the positive list. Whereas in case of the free trade agreement, the countries decide to reduce the custom duty or eliminate the customs duty on most of the goods which are traded between them. That is why we say that the free trade agreement is much more comprehensive in comparison to a preferential trade agreement. Apart from that, in case of free trade agreement, there may be certain goods on which the customs duty as such is not reduced. It is kept at the same level. So on these goods on which the custom duty is not reduced, all of these goods will be part of the negative list. So as you can see here, in case of the preferential trade agreement, what we have is a positive list, and this positive list basically includes those goods on which the countries decided to reduce the customs duty. Whereas in case of free trade agreement, we have a negative list, and the negative list will include a list of goods on which the countries will decide not to reduce the customs duty. Except the goods which are in the negative list, on all other goods, the customs duty is either reduced or eliminated. Now this free trade agreement could be in terms of FTA in goods or FTA in services. Now for example, as you can see here, we have a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka, we have a SAARC FTA, we have FTA with Nepal, Bhutan, ASEAN and so on. See, as discussed, as part of free trade agreements, the countries may either decide to reduce the custom duty or completely eliminate the customs duty. But usually, the reduction in the custom duty does not take place at one go. Usually, the custom duty is reduced over a period of time, which means that before implementing a full-fledged FTA, we have an implementation phase. During this implementation phase, slowly the countries may decide to reduce the customs duty. So this implementation phase of the free trade agreement is also referred to as the early harvest scheme. So as you can see, right now we are implementing the early harvest scheme with Thailand. So as part of this early harvest scheme, we are slowly and gradually reducing the customs duty on the goods which we are importing from Thailand. The same is applicable even to the goods which Thailand is importing from India. So the early harvest scheme is basically the implementation phase of a full-fledged the free trade agreement. The next phase of trade integration is CECA or CEPA. CECA here stands for Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, and CEPA here stands for Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. In comparison to free trade agreement, CECA or CEPA is much more broader and comprehensive. This is so because CECA or CEPA may cover free movement of goods, services, investment, mutual recognition of intellectual property rights and so on. Now for example, right now we have signed the CEPA with South Korea as well as Japan. Apart from that, we have signed CECA with Singapore and Malaysia. And these comprehensive economic cooperation agreement or partnership agreement, they cover the free movement in goods, services, investment and so on. For example, if you look at India-Japan CEPA, it covers for free movement of goods, services, investment. Apart from that, it also provides for mutual recognition of intellectual property rights. It basically means that if a person is filing for an IPR in Japan, automatically such an IPR would be recognized even in India as well. So CECA and CEPA are much more comprehensive and broader in comparison to a free trade agreement. That's the first thing. Secondly, in some of the online sources, it has been highlighted that there is a difference between CECA and CEPA. In some of the online sources, it has been highlighted that CECA covers only the goods, whereas CEPA covers goods, services and investment. Now this is a wrong interpretation of the difference between CECA and CEPA. This is so because if you look at the CEPA or CECA which we have signed with Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, and Japan, all of these agreements cover the free movement of goods, services, and investment. That's the first thing. Apart from that, in the FAQ released by the Ministry for Commerce and Industry, the FAQ as such has not delineated the difference between the CICA and CEPA. The FAQ considers CICA and CEPA as one, and it considers that both these free trade agreements include the integrated package of goods, services, and investment. So as far as the UPSC examination is concerned, one should go according to the FAQ published by the Ministry for Commerce and Industry. And as this FAQ highlights that both CICA and CEPA are an integrated package of goods, services, and investment, the same should be considered even for the UPSC examination as well. The next phase of trade integration is the customs union. Now, customs union is one step ahead of FTA, where customs union can be considered as FTA plus common tariff, which means that when countries come together to form a customs union, not only do they have a free trade agreement among themselves, but they also decide to import the goods from other third countries at common customs duty. Now let me simplify this by giving an example. Now in African continent, you have a customs union known as SACU, which stands for South African Customs Union. This is a custom union of countries which include South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, etc. Now this particular grouping as such has a free trade agreement among the countries. So when these countries, that is South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, etc. are importing goods from each other, they normally import the goods at zero customs duty. Apart from that, when these countries as a group, when they import goods from the other third countries, let's say India, all of these countries will import the goods at a common customs duty. Now, for example, if South Africa is importing textiles from India at 5% customs duty, even Botswana and Namibia will also import the textiles from India at 5% customs duty. So basically, all the countries which are part of the customs union will import the goods from third country at a common customs duty. That is why we call it as a customs union. The next stage of trade integration is a common market. Now, common market is one step ahead of customs union, where common market provides for customs union plus free movement of people. So, if a customs union provides for free movement of people, then we can call it as a common market. The last stage of trade integration is an economic union, where economic union can be considered as a common market plus a common currency, which means all the countries which have come together as part of economic union, they provide for the free movement of goods, services, investment, and people. Apart from that, these countries also adopt a common currency. Now, the best example happens to be the European Union, which is a kind of economic union. Now, as to in what way UPSC could ask question with respect to this particular topic in the prelims examination. See, one way of asking the question is they can ask you to arrange these stages of trade integration in the ascending or descending order. That's the first thing. Secondly, they can directly ask you a question related to the early harvest scheme. And thirdly, they can ask you a question related to difference between CICA or CEPA with the free trade agreement. So difference between the second stage and the third stage. If you know these aspects, that is more than sufficient. So let's start our discussion with respect to need for the free trade agreements. First and foremost, India must learn from its past mistakes which it had committed during 1947 to 1991. That is prior to the liberalization. So during this 1947 to 1991 phase, as you all know, India was importing goods from other countries at a higher customs duty. We did not give much amount of emphasis on boosting the exports from the Indian economy. We discouraged the foreign investment into the Indian economy. All these policies which we had pursued then, they are referred to as the inward oriented and protectionist policies. Now we have realized that these inward oriented and protectionist policies had a bad impact or an adverse impact on the Indian economy. For example, because of these protectionist policies, the domestic companies did not face the competition of the foreign companies. The domestic companies have now become complacent. They have not made adequate amount of investment in research and development. They are not focused upon innovation. They are not focused upon improving their efficiency. That is why we have not been able to manufacture goods which are globally competitive. So clearly, inward oriented and protectionist policies has not worked in India's favor as seen during the phase of 1947 to 1991. Now India has come up with a grand vision of becoming a $5 trillion economy. In order to become a $5 trillion economy, India needs to get integrated with the global economy. India cannot afford to follow inward oriented and protectionist policies. India now would have to adopt outward oriented and competitive policies. These outward oriented and competitive policies can be pursued by India by signing the free trade agreements. So these free trade agreements can emerge as a tool for India to become a $5 trillion economy. This is the first thing. Secondly, if you look at the countries such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, or in the recent times China, all of these countries have been able to achieve a phenomenal GDP growth rate in the past, predominantly because of greater integration with the global economy. Now, take for instance China. China, as you know, has emerged as a global manufacturing hub. China has emerged as the largest exporter of goods. Now, one of the reasons for the phenomenal GDP growth rate of China is because of its greater integration with the global economy. As you can see here, by signing more of free trade agreements, we can pursue a export-led virtuous economic cycle. Now, by signing free trade agreements, we would be able to increase our exports to other countries. The increase in exports would mean that there would be greater competition and innovation within the Indian economy. This can lead to creation of more of jobs. Now, this is critically important because the employment elasticity in case of India has been quite lower at zero point 0.1. So we can actually come out of the jobless growth which we are facing right now. We would be able to attract more of foreign investment and thus achieve a high GDP growth rate. Nextly, see, when we measure the GDP, we normally take into account four different parameters. That is the consumption expenditure, investment, the government expenditure, and the net value of exports. Out of these four drivers, the dominant driver of the Indian economy is the consumption expenditure, which accounts for almost 55% of India's GDP. So when we say consumption expenditure, it basically means that the Indian economy is predominantly growing because of the domestic demand. So we are manufacturing goods and services to cater to the domestic demand, and that is how we are able to achieve a higher GDP growth rate. On the other hand, as far as the net exports is concerned, it is calculated as total exports minus total imports. Now, the exports of the Indian economy last year, it was around 20% of India's GDP, and imports was around 21% of India's GDP. So the net value of exports for India is around minus 1% of India's GDP. So clearly, India has been able to achieve a higher GDP growth rate predominantly because of the domestic demand. Now, the Economic Survey 2018-19 has clearly highlighted that this particular model is unsustainable in the long run. How long can India afford to manufacture goods and services to cater to the domestic demand? See, ultimately, we must realize that there is a saturation point beyond which the domestic demand will not increase. So, if India has to become a $5 trillion economy, apart from catering to the domestic demand, we must also cater to the global demand. Now, look at China for an example. Now, China, it is catering to both its domestic demand as well as global demand. And because of this, China has been able to achieve a higher GDP growth rate. As far as India is concerned, we are basically catering only to the domestic demand and not to the global demand. That is why our share in exports is quite lower. So if we sign more of free trade agreements, India can shift from a consumption-led model to investment and export-driven model. That is, we can pursue this kind of virtuous economic cycle. Nextly, even the global environment is also conducive in order to enable India to boost its exports. This can be seen in the fact that presently there is a trade war between US and China is also losing its manufacturing competitiveness because of its increase in the labor cost. That is why some of the firms which are right now located in China, they are actually setting up their bases in Vietnam. Now question is, why are these firms going to Vietnam? Now this is because Vietnam has in turn signed a number of free trade agreements with countries such as European Union, USA, etc. Now when China is losing its manufacturing competitiveness, ideally it should be India which should be reaping the benefits, because just like China, we have the second largest population in the world. The labor cost in India is also lower. In spite of that, the companies as such are not coming to India, rather they are setting up of their bases in Vietnam. And this is because Vietnam has signed FTAs with other countries such as European Union, USA, etc. So if you sign the free trade agreement with a number of countries, automatically India will be able to attract the companies which are planning to exit from China. This will in turn give a boost to both Make in India as well as Assemble in India. The Economic Survey 2019-20 had clearly highlighted that by integrating the Assemble in India with the Make in India, we can create 4 crore jobs by the end of 2025 and 8 crore jobs by the end of 2030. And lastly, by signing more of free trade agreements, as I discussed before, we would be able to boost the overall innovation and efficiency of the domestic companies in India. So there are a number of compelling reasons as to why should India sign the free trade agreements. That is why India has signed a free trade agreements with a number of countries, which I had shown you in the previous slide. However, as highlighted before, India's experience with the free trade agreements has been a mixed bag so far. This has been highlighted by the Surjit Bhalla Committee, which was earlier appointed by the government. According to Surjit Bhalla Committee, on one hand, the FTAs which we have signed with countries such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. have benefited us, whereas the FTAs with the larger economies have led to a number of challenges. See, as far as the benefits is concerned, after signing the FTAs with the countries, there has been overall increase in the volume of bilateral trade with the countries. So the overall volume of bilateral trade, both in terms of imports as well as exports, has increased after signing the FTAs. Secondly, by signing FTAs, India has been able to have access to high quality raw materials from other countries at almost 0% customs duty, and this in turn has given a fillip to Make in India and Assemble in India. And nextly, see, India's strength does not lies in manufacturing. India's strength lies in services. And after signing the FTAs, India's export of services to these countries has increased. So these are the benefits. In spite of these benefits, as I said, there are a number of challenges. First and foremost, as I discussed before, the overall volume of bilateral trade has increased. But the imports into India has been much higher than our exports to the FTA partners, and this in turn has led to an increase in the trade deficit. For example, India's trade deficit with countries such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, ASEAN, etc. has widened after the signing of free trade agreements. Nextly, some of the free trade agreements have also led to the inverted duty structure. See, in case of inverted duty structure, the customs duty on the finished products is much lower in comparison to the customs duty on the raw materials. So, in case of the inverted duty structure, it will become much more cheaper to import the finished goods in comparison to the raw materials, because of which the domestic manufacturing gets adversely affected. Now, take for instance, now let's say we are importing, say, finished tires or the natural rubber. Now, as part of the free trade agreement with Japan, for example, let's say we are given a commitment that we will import the finished tires at 0% customs duty. But we may be importing rubber from some other third country at say 5% customs duty. So 0% import duty on tires and 5% import duty on natural rubber will in turn encourage the more import of finished tires, and it will discourage the domestic manufacturing of tires in India. And the same has happened particularly after signing of free trade agreement with some countries. Nextly, FTAs have also led to an adverse impact on some of the labor intensive sectors such as textile, leather, and so on. And lastly, we have not been able to optimally utilize the free trade agreements. The Surjit Bhalla Committee has said that the FTI utilization rate in case of India is hardly around 5%, which means let's say we have a potential to export goods worth $100 billion to Japan. Even though the potential is worth $100 billion, we are able to export only 5% of our potential, which means in this case, only around $5 billion. So we have not been able to leverage the free trade agreements optimally. In this regard, the Surjit Bhalla Committee has given a number of recommendations. First and foremost, we must renegotiate the existing FTAs in order to protect India's interest. So we must go back to the drawing board. We must try to identify as to which all FTAs have led to an adverse impact on the Indian economy, which all FTAs have led to the inverted duty structure, which FTAs have caused an adverse impact on labor intensive industries, and accordingly we must renegotiate these FTAs with the individual member countries. So that's the first thing we must do. Secondly, one of the reasons as to why we have not been able to boost our exports is because of poor trade competitiveness. Particularly, if you look at the logistic cost in case of India, it is much higher at almost around 14% of India's GDP. In comparison, the logistic cost in countries such as say UK, EU, etc., it is hardly around 8 to 10%. So since the logistic cost is higher, by the time we export our goods to other countries, the value of our goods would be much more costlier in comparison to other goods, and that is where we are losing out. So we must reduce the logistic cost and improve the ease of doing business so that we are able to leverage the FTAs optimally. Thirdly, we must also give adequate amount of protection to our domestic market from the import of the cheaper foreign goods. So if any country is trying to dump its goods in the Indian domestic market, we must immediately impose the anti-dumping duty to protect the domestic market. Nextly, see, as I said, that present FTA utilization rate is hardly around 5%. One of the reason for this is the poor utilization of FTAs by the MSMEs. MSMEs as such do not have the necessary knowledge or awareness as to which all goods they can export to our FTA partners. So what we need to do here is we need to launch a FTA utilization mission. This particular mission should provide the necessary hand-holding support to the MSMEs. And last and most important is one of the recommendation given by the Baba Kalyani Committee on the Special Economic Zones. See, special economic zones, as you know, they are the zones which we have created in order to boost exports from India. So when the industries are located in these SEZs, the industries get a number of incentives, and these incentives are in turn dependent upon their ability to exports. This idea of SEZ, we have taken it from China. Now, if you look at China, in case of China, the SEZs have become extremely successful. Now, take for example Shenzhen. Now, Shenzhen SEZ, when it was initially started way back in 1980s, it was a small fishing village. But now from a small fishing village, it has become a largest city in the universe. Most of the global manufacturing companies are based in this Chinese SEZ. On the other hand, India has failed to optimally utilize the SEZs in order to boost its exports. Hence, Baba Kalyani Committee has given a number of recommendations as to how the SEZs can be revitalized in order to boost exports. One of the most important recommendations of the Baba Kalyani Committee is to rename these SEZs as 3Es. Now, 3Es here stand for employment and economic enclaves. Apart from change in the nomenclature or change in the name, our orientation towards SEZ should also change. In what way should it change? See, right now, the incentives are given to various industries in the SEZs depending upon how much goods and services they are exporting to other countries. Higher the exports, higher the incentives. So purely incentives are given only on the exports. The Baba Kalyani Committee has said that apart from giving incentives only on exports, we must also give incentives based upon a number of other factors as well. For example, how much jobs they are creating, what kind of technology they have adopted, how much of value addition they are doing. So by providing incentives on multiple factors, we will be able to create more of jobs. We would be able to encourage the domestic companies to adopt advanced technology. We would be able to increase their manufacturing competitiveness, and we would be able to promote more of value addition to our exports and realize higher potential of the free trade agreements. So these are some of the recommendations given by the Baba Kalyani Committee. So first thing is we must rename the SEZs as 3Es, and secondly, instead of giving incentives only on exports, Incentives must be given based on number of factors such as the jobs, technology, value addition, and so on. Now coming to the mains question for practice, as you can see here, this particular question has basically two distinct dimensions. The first dimension is with respect to adverse impact of the free trade agreements, and the second dimension is with respect to measures needed to optimally harness the FTAs. So the body of this particular answer should incorporate these two dimensions. Apart from this, in this particular answer, I have also incorporated the suggested introduction as well as conclusion. You can pause this particular video and have a look at the suggested answer. Now, based upon our discussion, I hope you should be in a position to attempt the practice MCQ number 1, 2 as well as 3. Let's solve the practice MCQ number 4. The question here is, which among the following can be considered as a violation of the most favored nation clause provided under the WTO? The options given here are signing of free trade agreement with another country, differential customs duty for different countries, special preference to goods imported from poor economies. See, under the most favored nation clause, if a particular member country decides to offer a trade concession to another member country, automatically such a trade concession will be made applicable to all other member countries as well. Now, for example, let's say India provides a trade concession to US. Now, let's say India decides to import textiles from US at 2% customs duty. Automatically, this kind of trade concession will be given to all other member countries as per the most favored nation clause. The idea here is to ensure that one member country treats all the member countries equally and one member country does not discriminate against another member country. But at the same time, World Trade Organization itself has provided certain exceptions to the most favored nation clause. And these two exceptions are signing of free trade agreement with another country and special preference to goods imported from poor economies. Which means that if India is signing a FTA with another country, India need not extend the same trade concession to other member countries. Secondly, if India decides to import goods from poor economies at 0% custom duty, this kind of trade concession will not be made applicable to other member countries. So these are the two exceptions which have been provided under the MFN clause. So accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be C, that is 2 only. As far as the other practice questions are concerned, please do let us know the answer in the comment section given below. With this, let us take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 10. Now, this particular article becomes important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of environment and biodiversity. Now, this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because recently the Ministry for Environment, Forest and Climate Change has released the State of Forest Report 2021. Please do note here that this particular report is published by the Forest Survey of India on a biennial basis. That is, it is published every 2 years. So last time such a report was published in the year 2019, and now in the year 2021 it has been republished with the updated facts and figures related to the forest cover in India. So as the name suggests, this particular report provides us with information related to the forest cover, tree cover and the mangrove cover in India. As far as the importance of this particular report is concerned, from the perspective of prelims, we can expect direct questions from the State of Forest report. As you can see in previous year prelims, questions have been asked with respect to various aspects of the forest cover. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, you could incorporate the highlights of this particular report as a fodder points in order to substantiate your answers in GS paper 3, environment and biodiversity. So let us look into the important highlights of the State of Forest report 2021. First and foremost, let us try to understand the difference between the forest area as categorized by the Forest Survey of India in its State of Forest report and the recorded forest area. See, if you look at the forest as a subject, it is placed under the concurrent list, which means that we have laws passed by both Parliament as well as the concerned state legislative assembly with respect to protection of forest. So the Parliament of India has passed the Indian Forest Act 1927. Similarly, the state governments have their own respective state acts. So both the center as well as state, they have been empowered to declare the area as forest. So whenever an area is declared as a forest, either by the central government under the Indian Forest Act 1927 or by the state government under their respective state acts, then such area will be considered as a recorded forest area. So the central government or the state government can declare a particular area either as a reserved forest or the protected forest. So this is the concept of the recorded forest area. But the way the Forest Survey of India considers the area under forest for the state of forest report is a little different. The Forest Survey of India takes into account all the lands which have more than 1 hectare in area and a tree canopy density of more than 10% as a forest area. And this is irrespective of the purpose for which the land is used, the ownership of the land, or a legal status of the land. Now let me simplify this by giving an example. Now let's say there is a plantation which is owned by a farmer. Now this particular plantation may be more than 1 hectare in area and it may have a tree canopy of more than 10%. Now even though this particular land as such is not explicitly categorized as forest, and even though it is not under the ownership of the government, this plantation, since it fulfills these two criteria, it will be considered as forest by the Forest Survey of India in its report. So this particular important difference between the forest area as considered under the State of Forest Report 2021 and the recorded forest area is extremely important as far as your prelims examination is concerned. So please do understand here, any area which is more than 1 hectare in size and a tree canopy of more than 10%, it is considered as forest as per the Forest Survey of India. And this is irrespective of the land use, ownership and the legal status. Now coming to the important highlights of the State of Forest Report 2021. As you can see, the total area under forest is around 80.9 million hectares. So approximately around 24.62% of India's geographical area is under forest. And as you know, our target is to have at least 33% of the area under the forest. So we are still far away from the target. In comparison to the State of Forest Report 2019, there has been increase in the area of forest by almost around 2,261 square kilometer. Now, depending upon the tree canopy density, we have different types of forests, that is very dense forest, moderately dense forest and the open forest. Very dense forests are those forests in which the tree canopy density is more than 70%. Moderately dense means those forests in which the tree canopy density is between 40 to 70. And open forest means that the tree canopy density is more than 10%. Now coming to the states which have the highest forest cover, in terms of absolute area, the state which has the highest area under forest is Madhya Pradesh, and it is followed by Arunachal Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Maharashtra. And in terms of percentage, Mizoram has the largest percentage of area under forest. As you can see, it has almost around 85% of its land under forest, and it is followed by Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Manipur and Nagaland. And there are certain states and union territories which have forest cover of above 75%. And these states and union territories include Lakshadweep, Mizoram, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Arunachal Pradesh and Meghalaya. In comparison to the State of Forest Report 2019, some states have shown an increase in forest cover. And among the states which have shown an increase in forest cover, it is Andhra Pradesh, and Andhra Pradesh is followed by Telangana and Odisha. The State of Forest Report has also highlighted that there has been a drastic decline in the forest cover in some of the states. In particular, if you look at the 8 northeastern states in India, these northeastern states account for almost around 24% of the total forest cover. And in comparison to the State of Forest Report 2019, these 8 states have lost almost around 1,000 square kilometers of forest. And this is predominantly because of the shifting cultivation which is predominantly practiced in the northeastern part of India. Among these 8 states, Manipur has recorded the largest loss in the forest cover. As far as the mangrove cover is concerned, the total mangrove cover in India as per this particular report is around 4,992 square kilometer, and in comparison to the previous State of Forest report, there has been increase in the mangrove cover by almost around 17 square kilometer. The top 3 states which have shown a largest increase in the mangrove cover include Odisha, and Odisha is followed by Maharashtra and Karnataka. The State of Forest Report 2021 has also tried to estimate the extent of forest cover in the tiger reserves and lion conservation area, that is the Gir National Park. This is basically done in order to understand the impact of the environmental conservation measures which the government has taken so far. Accordingly, this particular report has highlighted that in the last decade, there has been a decline in the forest cover in the 52 tiger reserves and the lion conservation area in India. Out of these 52 tiger reserves, almost around 32 tiger reserves have shown a decline in their area under forest, while only around 20 tiger reserves have shown a increasing trend. Among the tiger reserves whose area under forest has increased, the highest increase has been in the Baksa Tiger Reserve in West Bengal, followed by Annamalai in Tamil Nadu and Indravati Tiger Reserve in Chhattisgarh. The highest decrease in area under forest was found in Bhadra Tiger Reserve in Karnataka, followed by Sundarbans in West Bengal. So these are the important highlights of the State of Forest Report 2021, which one should know as far as your prelims examination is concerned. With this, let us take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 8. Now this particular article is related to the Model Code of Conduct. Accordingly, this article shall be important with respect to prelims under the subsection of polity and governance. So as far as the prelims examination is concerned, one should be aware about various aspects of the Model Code of Conduct. So once we discuss this particular topic, we'll also take up a prelims based MCQ for the practice. So let us understand various aspects of the Model Code of Conduct. I hope all of you must be knowing that Article 324 of the Indian Constitution empowers the Election Commission of India with the general superintendence and control of the conduct of elections. Accordingly, the Election Commission of India has come up with the guidelines known as a Model Code of Conduct. Now, these guidelines basically regulate the behavior of the political parties, the behavior of individual candidates who are contesting the elections. And this is basically done in order to ensure the smooth conduct of elections. See, the party which is in power, such a political party may misuse the state official machinery for the campaigning of elections. Similarly, the party which is in power may announce new welfare related schemes just before the election in order to get more votes. And this can go against the interest of the other political parties which are contesting the elections. So there is a need to create a level playing field between the ruling party and the opposition parties. Similarly, we need to create a level playing field between the individual candidates who are contesting the elections. So the Model Code of Conduct seeks to achieve all of these objectives. The Model Code of Conduct was initially adopted for the first time in the state of Kerala in the year 1960. Later, in 1968, the Model Code of Conduct was adopted through consensus among all the political parties. So even though the Election Commission of India has formulated this Model Code of Conduct, this formulation has been based upon the consensus among all the political parties. So please understand here that the Model Code of Conduct does not enjoy any kind of statutory backing as such, which means there is no legal backing or a law which provides for a Model Code of Conduct. And since there is no law which provides for a Model Code of Conduct, the provisions of the Model Code of Conduct are largely non-enforceable. But at the same time, you must understand here that there are certain provisions in the Model Code of Conduct which also overlap with the Representation of People's Act 1951. Now, for example, under the Representation of People Act 1951, a candidate who is contesting for elections cannot make an appeal to the voters to vote on the grounds of religion or language. This is termed as a corrupt practice under the Representation of People's Act. The same provision is incorporated in the Model Code of Conduct as well. So if a candidate is appealing to voters to vote on the grounds of religion, it is not only a violation of Model Code of Conduct, but it is also a violation of the Representation of People's Act 1951. So since it is a violation of the Representation of People Act 1951, obviously the Election Commission of India can take action under this particular law. So what you must understand here is that there are certain provisions in the Model Code of Conduct which may overlap with the other laws. In this case, the example which I have given is Representation of People's Act 1951. And hence, such provisions will obviously be enforceable. Now, as far as when does the Model Code of Conduct comes into effect, the Model Code of Conduct comes into effect as soon as the Election Commission of India announces the election schedule, and it remains in force till the completion of the election. Now, you must understand here what normally happens is the Election Commission of India first announces the election schedule in the press conference. So, once the announcement is done, later, say after around 1 week or 10 days, the Election Commission of India comes up with a notification of the election schedule. So, initially there was a confusion as to when does the Model Code of Conduct comes into picture. Whether will it come into picture when the announcement is done by the Election Commission of India, or when the Election Commission of India comes up with a gazette notification. Now, the Supreme Court of India has laid down that the Model Code of Conduct will come into force as soon as the Election Commission of India announces the date of election. So, there is no need to wait until the notification, which may take around 7 to 10 days, for the Model Code of Conduct to come in. The Model Code of Conduct comes into effect as soon as the Election Commission of India announces the election schedule. Now, this is very important from the perspective of your UPSC prelims examination. Now, as far as what are the important provisions of the Model Code of Conduct, see, obviously there are a number of provisions in the Model Code of Conduct, but here I have incorporated only the most important provisions. For example, first and foremost, the government which is in power, either at the center or the states, cannot use the official vehicles for the campaigning of elections. There is a complete ban on transfer of officials who are involved in the election work. However, in case of certain urgency or emergency conditions, if at all any officers would have to be transferred, then in such cases the government would have to take the prior approval of the Election Commission of India. No minister can summon the government officials involved in election work. The government cannot issue any kind of political advertisements at the cost of the taxpayers' money. So if the government which is in power wants to issue the advertisements when the Model Code of Conduct is in force, the government would have to use its own money, that is the political party's money, and not the taxpayers' money. No candidate should appeal to voters to vote on the grounds of religion, and no political party or the candidates can carry out canvassing of votes within a distance of 100 meters of the polling station. These two provisions, the last two provisions, are also incorporated in the Representation of People Act 1951. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know as far as the Model Code of Conduct is concerned. So based upon our discussion, please have a look at this particular practice question and let us know the answer in the comment section given below. Now the next article appears on page number 12. The article is titled as State Bank of India raises $300 million via the Formosa bonds. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of Indian economy. Now, before understanding as to how this particular topic becomes important from the perspective of the prelims examination, let me first give you the background. See, in the year 2014, the International Finance Corporation, which is an arm of the World Bank, had issued the Masala bonds. Subsequently, in prelims 2016 and prelims 2019, as you can see, we had these two questions related to the Masala bonds. Accordingly, as far as this particular article is concerned, one should be aware about the different types of bonds issued in the capital markets across the world, including the concept of the Formosa bonds. So let's understand various aspects of this particular article. See, whenever an Indian company wants to raise capital, the Indian company can issue bonds, and these bonds can be issued either in the domestic market or they can be issued in the foreign countries. Normally, when the company issues the bonds in the domestic market, these bonds are denominated in terms of the Indian currency, that is rupees. So the face value of the bonds will be denominated in terms of rupees. As far as the foreign countries is concerned, in the foreign countries, the Indian companies can issue bonds either in terms of the foreign currency. So the foreign currency could be, say, dollar, euro, pound, yen, yuan, etc. So the bonds will be denominated in terms of foreign currency, or they can be denominated even in terms of rupees as well. So when an Indian company raises capital from foreign countries in terms of rupees, Such bonds are normally referred to as the masala bonds. So these masala bonds can be issued in different countries such as USA, European Union, Japan, etc. For the first time, these masala bonds were issued by the International Finance Corporation, which is an arm of the World Bank. Subsequently, a number of Indian companies have also issued the masala bonds. First among them was SDFC. Apart from masala bonds, you have another type of bonds known as the Maharaja bonds. So, what exactly are the Maharaja bonds? See, as I said, the International Finance Corporation has issued the masala bonds, and these masala bonds are denominated in terms of rupees and they are issued in the foreign countries. As far as the Maharaja bonds are concerned, these Maharaja bonds are also denominated in terms of rupees. But these Maharaja bonds, they are not issued in the foreign countries. Rather, they are issued in India. That is, the International Finance Corporation raises money within India by issuing the rupee denominated Maharaja bonds. So if you look at the Maharaja bonds and compare them with the Masala bonds, both these two bonds are denominated in terms of rupees. But the Masala bonds, they are issued in the foreign countries, but the Maharaja bonds, they are issued in India. So here I have tabulated the different types of bonds which are issued in the capital markets across the world. As you can see in this particular table, I have highlighted as to in which currency each of these bonds are denominated, in which country these bonds are issued, and who issues these bonds. For example, as discussed about the masala bonds, they are the rupee denominated bonds issued by the Indian companies and the International Finance Corporation in the foreign countries. The Maharaja bonds are the rupee denominated bonds issued by the International Finance Corporation in India. Similarly, you have the Uridashi masala bonds. Now, the Uridashi masala bonds are similar to the masala bonds, except the fact that these Uridashi masala bonds are specific to Japan. So, whenever an Indian company wants to raise loans from Japan in terms of the Indian currency, that is rupees, then such Indian companies can issue the Uridashi masala bonds. Next, we have the Panda bonds. The Panda bonds are issued by the foreign companies in mainland China, and these bonds are denominated in terms of the Chinese currency, that is yuan. So, whenever any foreign company wants to raise capital in China in terms of yuan, such a foreign company can issue the Panda bond. Now, these Panda bonds were in news in the year 2018-19 when the Pakistan government decided to issue the Panda bonds in China in order to raise loans in terms of yuan. Next, we have the dim sum bonds. Dim sum bonds are issued by the foreign companies in Hong Kong, and these bonds are denominated in terms of yuan. So, basic difference between the Panda bonds and dim sum bonds are that the Panda bonds are issued in mainland China, whereas the dim sum bonds are issued in Hong Kong by the foreign companies. Next, we have the samurai bonds. The samurai bonds are issued by the foreign companies in Japan, and these bonds are denominated in terms of Japanese currency, that is yen. So as far as Indian companies are concerned, if the Indian companies wants to raise capital from Japan, they can raise capital in terms of the rupee denominated bonds or the yen denominated bonds. When they want to raise loans in terms of rupees, the Indian companies would have to issue the Uridashi masala bonds, and if they want to raise loans in terms of yen, then the Indian companies would have to issue the samurai bonds. Next, we have the Yankee bonds, which are the dollar denominated bonds issued in USA by the foreign companies. And next, we have the Formosa bonds, which have been issued by the State Bank of India recently. The Formosa bonds are the bonds which are issued by the foreign companies in Taiwan, and these bonds, as such, they can be denominated in any other currency except the Taiwanese dollar. So they can be denominated in terms of dollar, euro, yuan, etc. So when any foreign company wants to raise capital from Taiwan, and if it wants to raise capital in a currency which is different from the Taiwanese dollar, then such a foreign company can issue what is known as the Formosa bonds. Now, the State Bank of India has become the first scheduled bank from India to issue the Formosa bonds. That is why this particular topic becomes important. So, these are some of the important bonds which are issued in the capital markets across the world. Out of these, the most important ones happens to be the Masala bonds, Maharaja bonds, and the Uridashi Masala bonds. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 4. Now, this particular article is related to the electoral bonds. Hence, this article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of polity and governance. So, as far as this particular article is concerned, from the perspective of prelims, one should be aware about the working mechanism of electoral bonds. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be aware about the critical analysis of the electoral bonds. That is, to what extent the electoral bonds have improved the overall transparency and accountability in the political funding of elections. Now, all of these aspects have already been covered by me in the DNS dated 16th June 2021. So based upon this particular discussion, let us try to solve this prelim space MCQ. So when you look at the electoral bonds can be used by the corporates or the individuals to make contribution to the political parties. So the corporate and individuals can buy the electoral bonds from certain designated branches of the State Bank of India. These electoral bonds are considered as the bearer bonds. The electoral bonds can be bought only through the digital payments or checks. This is basically done in order to prevent the flow of black money into the funding of elections. They can be denominated in multiple currencies such as 1000, 10,000, 1 lakh, 10 lakh, and 1 crore. The minimum donation to the electoral bonds can be rupees 1000 and there is no maximum limit on the donation. The maturity period of these electoral bonds is considered to be 15 days. This is so because a political party would have to redeem the electoral bonds into its bank account within the 15 days. Only those political parties which have secured at least 1% of the votes in the last general elections or in the last state assembly elections are eligible to get the funding through the electoral bonds. So based upon this particular understanding, let us try to solve this particular prelims based MCQ. The question here is, which among the following statements related to electoral bonds is incorrect? The first one is, only those political parties which have secured more than 1% of the votes in the last general elections or the state assembly elections are eligible to get the funding. The second statement is, subsidiaries of foreign companies registered in India can donate through the electoral bonds. Third statement is, electoral bonds cannot be purchased multiple times by the same applicant. And the last option is, there is no maximum limit on donation through the electoral bonds. So what do you think is the answer to this particular question? Let us know in the comments section. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day. The answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option B.